Let's take a look at the Western Hemisphere since 1945. One of the things that happens since 1945 that we have mentioned it before, but at the end of World War II, then there are two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, or the USSR. This launches into the Cold War, and we've already talked about the Cold War. It's from 1945 to 1990. The Cold War will continue, and lots of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States during that period. However, by 1990, we'll see that we have just one power left. The Soviet Union collapses, and this leaves the United States as the sole superpower. So that sort of gives you where we're going. But let's take a look at how we get there. What happens in the United States from 1945 to 1990 and beyond. Now, the president during World War II is Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR. He is actually president an unprecedented amount of time. He is president starting in 1933. That is, he's elected in 1932. He is reelected in 1936. He is reelected in 1940, and he's reelected in 1944. It's because of him the law has been changed. Presidents can now only serve 2 terms as president. That is a total of 8 years. Had he completed all of his term, but he died in office, he would have been president for 16 years. At any rate, Franklin Roosevelt comes to power during the time of the Great Depression, and he will use his influence to transform the United States into a welfare state and into debt spending in his what is called the New Deal. So the New Deal is supposed to save the United States economically. However, many people have pointed out that we didn't really get out of the recession or the Great Depression until we entered World War II. We had a massive amount of spending then, and that changed everything. So one of the things we do see, however, is that during this period, certainly from 1933 to 1945, well, even before that, the power to the federal government is magnified to a tremendous amount, much more than it had ever been before. And the idea of deficit spending, that is spending money you don't have to do government programs primarily, becomes the way in which Roosevelt attempts to end the Great Depression. And of course, all these things he put into play, the welfare state, deficit spending, the income tax, graduated income tax, all of these things are still around today. And certainly the federal government has a tremendous power today, much more than it did, say, before FDR. And today it even has, in many ways, more power than FDR had. Well, after World War II then, so let's say from 1945 on, the United States is in an economic boom. We are now a superpower. We are past the war, and many people had shortages of things during the war. There was rationing of meat, rationing of tires, rationing of gasoline, and so forth. And after having this restriction on it, first of the Great Depression where they didn't have really any money, and then the war where everything is rationed, or after the war, the economy begins to boom and people begin to buy more and more things primarily because they can, and they have been denied for so long. The wages go up, the economy goes up, the number of babies goes up. This is where we talk about a boom of babies, or baby boomers, as they are sometimes called. These are people born, I think they typically say, between 1945 or 46 and 1963 or 64. It's a time of prosperity. It's a time when television is introduced in the United States and becomes a very popular form of entertainment, and it transforms the culture as well. So this is the 40s and the 50s. When we get to the 60s, things are very tumultuous, very tumultuous. The Cold War is there. There's a lot of tension. We will get involved in places like Korea and Vietnam and other areas where we try to counter the Soviet Union. Another area where we have a lot of tension is in space. The Soviets are ahead of us in the space progress, space race it comes to be called. And they actually orbit a man long before we do, so 2 or 3 years. We begin in earnest our space program, and when JFK, pictured here, of course, John F. Kennedy, he will make a challenge. He will set a goal that the United States will land a man on the moon before the end of this decade. And he's saying that towards the beginning of his presidency in the early 60s. And we certainly did do that before the end of the decade. So that was achieved, and we did get superiority in the area of space race. And that did a lot of things for us as far as technology development. Many of the things that become standard things in our lives, computers, microwaves, and many other things, are developed because of this space race. Well, John F. Kennedy is elected president in the fall of 1960, becomes president. He doesn't even complete one term. He is assassinated in November of 1963. In Texas. And of course, this has been discussed in depth and in detail. Some people believe it is a conspiracy that brought about his assassination. The official commission that studied it for many weeks, many months, came to the conclusion that it was a single gunman who killed him. At any rate, when Kennedy is assassinated, it shocks the nation, and it brings his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, into office. He is sworn in on the very plane that is carrying the body of the president as they fly back to Washington, D.C. Lyndon Johnson then completes Kennedy's term and runs for election for president and wins that election in 1964. And he decides, as we're going to see, that he will not run for a second term. But during his years as president, he too, like Roosevelt, will dramatically change things in the United States. He has what he calls the Great Society, where he focuses mostly on domestic issues, like spending money on education, changing the education system, changing the medical, revising the medical system, focusing on poverty, for example, as well. And he brings about in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, and in 1965 the Voting Rights Act. Johnson was from Texas. He was a man of the South, most people believe. But he was very concerned about civil rights, especially for African Americans. And so these acts, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act, and so forth, these will help to assure that African Americans have more rights, have more equality, and more access to being able to vote. And there is still a lot of tension, even though he does this. We see that there are racial riots in Los Angeles in the neighborhood of Watts. And, of course, the leader who emerges as the most important leader of the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King Jr., who forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He sets forth a policy much like Gandhi. I think that's where he got it, the idea from Gandhi, to use nonviolence to achieve change. So don't be violent, be nonviolent. He does that through using marches and speeches and legislation and publicity and so forth. Now, I put these three pictures up, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., because all three of them will end up being assassinated. John F. Kennedy in 1963, and as we're going to see in 1968, his brother, who was running for president, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. are both assassinated in 1968. 1968 is a year that is often said, as you see on the cover of Life magazine here, the year that changed the world, 1968. During Kennedy's years, we got involved in Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and Johnson expands that war, and that's a very unpopular war with people. A lot of people don't understand it. And so once we've entered that war, as we do, let's say in 1963, first as advisors, then we get more involved, actively sending lots of troops there. During the Johnson years especially, it will grow. And this is the big reason why Johnson did not run for a second term, which he could have, because of the war itself. Well, in 1968, what I have here for you is just a list. Starting in January, I think I have one or two things for every month of the year. Pretty big events. So, for example, in January, the North Koreans. You think we just have problems with North Koreans now? No. That started a long time ago. They seize the USS Pueblo, which is a surveillance ship, a spy ship. They were spying. We were spying on the North Koreans. Should not be surprised by that. They had radio equipment and so forth. They were trying to detect what's going on. The North Koreans seize the ship. They take control of it. They hold the crew hostage for 11 months. And they did that, took control of it in 1968. Also in January of 1968, in the Vietnam War, there was a major offensive called the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War. This was a surprise attack. In the Tet Offensive, Tet was a big holiday in Vietnam, sort of like Christmas or Thanksgiving, or maybe both put together. And so most people didn't believe anything was going to happen. They were kind of relaxed. But of course, there was a coordinated strike all across Vietnam against U.S. forces. And this was seen as a turning point in the war. It seemed like perhaps we were going to handle this war and we were going to be able to put an end to it. This made it clear that the resistance was going to be very strong. We also see that in February of 1968, a commission which Johnson had put together to check on racial tension in the U.S., the Kerner Commission, came back with this statement, that the nation, that is the United States, was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate, and unequal. So despite what Johnson had been trying to do and what Martin Luther King Jr. had been trying to do, things were still very tense and very uneven. In March then of 1968, LBJ, that's Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president, announces he will not run for another term. This is coming fairly late because normally the primaries and all that start in January. He announces in March he's not going to run. So this now opens it up. There were already some people running, like Robert F. Kennedy. He was one of the favorites. And then Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, they're going to enter into the race and in earnest now after this. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis. He goes there because of a bus strike. There's been some racial discrimination in Memphis, especially on the buses. At any rate, he is assassinated there in Memphis, Tennessee. And once that happens, there are race riots that break out right after this in at least 100 cities around the United States in a protest of this event. In 1968, getting back to the Vietnam War, the Supreme Court rules that burning a draft card is not free speech. It had been argued that it was free speech, but the Supreme Court says no, it's not. Because at this time, of course, the United States had a draft. Of course, every male had to register, age of 18 above. And you weren't just registering, you still have to do that today. But it wasn't just a registration for registration's sake. This was actually registering for a lottery that I guess a lot of people didn't want to win. This lottery is if your number came up, then you were drafted, you were placed into the military, and ultimately you would end up, most people ended up in Vietnam. Out on the campaign trail, Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, is assassinated in June of 1968. And so it was a tumultuous time in the United States. There were riots, there was war, there were assassinations, there was tension. The country was divided over the war. It was broadcast on the news every night. For the first time, it was a televised war. There's a Poor People's Campaign march on the National Mall. That's what you see in this picture down here at the mall. It's for poor people. This was set up by Martin Luther King Jr. before he obviously had been assassinated. He had put in motion this, and it went forward. So it becomes, yes, a protest, sort of a mixing of the racial problems and the war problems, and everybody shows up. This is the Washington, D.C., the mall area, and it's just packed with people, thousands and thousands, estimated to be 50,000 people show up here. So you've got the Vietnam War here, using helicopters. You've got Martin Luther King Jr. You've got, of course, the space race going on. You've got the march here, the National Mall, and of course these are the Beatles that are here. Well, in July of 1968, Intel begins. So we see that computers are coming to the forefront. When the Democrats meet together to choose their candidate, we'll see that their convention, the convention for the Democrats in August, was held in Chicago. The mayor of Chicago was Mayor Daley, very powerful, old school Democrat who had delivered Illinois to John F. Kennedy in a deal made with Kennedy's father between Mayor Daley and Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father. He could deliver Chicago, and there were enough votes in Chicago that he could deliver the entire state if he got enough votes in Chicago, which he did. And so, another deal was made with him. People were making deals with him, and so he got the convention to be held in Chicago. But when they show up there, it turns into a big mess because the convention is, it's not all decided because Johnson had pulled out of the race. Robert F. Kennedy had been assassinated. It was very tumultuous. He had the war going on. And he had all these protesters decided to show up because it was Johnson, of course, who was a Democrat, who had pushed forward this war. And so riots are there. The police use physical violence against the protesters, many who are called hippies, and that sort of thing. And it's just a real mess. Well, in September of 1968, the first jumbo jet, the Boeing 747, is introduced. And the Olympics are taking place in 1968 in October. U.S. Olympic athletes, African American, two of them, runners, I believe. One comes, I believe, in first and one in third, but they decide that they will raise their hands in a fist while wearing a black glove, which was a symbol at the time of protest, black power, oppression of African Americans, that sort of thing. Richard Nixon is the Republican candidate, and he will win this election in 1968 over Hubert Humphrey. And Nixon then comes into office. That's in November, and also in November, the Beatles, pictured here, come out with their White Album in 1968, which is sort of often believed to be a kind of a drug-induced album. So they have really changed from their beginnings of about 5-6 years earlier. Elvis Presley, who had been out of the picture for a while, makes a comeback in December of 1968. And in December of 1968, the first manned lunar orbit of the moon takes place. Getting very close to achieving that goal with JFK had set. And it will be achieved in 1969. And we will land someone on the moon. Now, Richard Nixon comes into power. He's elected in 68. He becomes president in 69. He had vowed in his election he would bring an honorable end to the Vietnam War. He does bring an end to the war. He does end the draft, and the draft was a very controversial thing. People did not want the draft. He has some achievements in foreign policy. In 1972, he goes to China. And there he changes foreign policy by meeting. He had been very anti-communist. He was a very anti-communist. There's a saying, only Nixon could go to China, because Nixon was so anti-communist that when he goes to China, a communist country, and starts to build relations there, it becomes clear that things are going to change, but that he is doing this, not because he's weak on communism, but because he sees it as sort of a way to drive a wedge between China, communist China, and the communist Soviet Union. He runs for re-election in 72. He wins in a landslide. But as part of this, he was always seen as being paranoid. His paranoid nature led him to direct his campaign to do whatever they could to try to make sure he won. And so one of the things that happens is that a group of people called plumbers. They weren't plumbers, but they broke into the Watergate complex, which held one of the things it had there was the Democratic National Committee headquarters, to look through the files to try to find things on his opponents and others. So since it was in this complex of places where people had offices and where people had apartments, called Watergate, which is still there, the building's still there, it gets called the Watergate scandal, and therefore Watergate gets associated with scandal. So now if we put gate at the end of anything, we mean it's a scandal. Iran Gate, Trooper Gate, or whatever. Okay? The proceedings begin on Nixon in the House of Representatives to impeach him. But before he could be removed from office, he resigns and he leaves. He gets on a helicopter and he flies out. This brings his vice president, this is Nixon here, and next to him in the picture, that is Gerald R. Ford. Gerald Ford then becomes president of the United States. Now, he had become vice president because Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned in a scandal over money, taxes, that sort of thing. And so Nixon had appointed Ford as his vice president. So Ford was never elected vice president. He had been in the House of Representatives. He was from Michigan. He'd been a quarterback at the University of Michigan. And he was a well-known politician in Washington, a deal maker, that sort of thing. So he comes in as vice president, and then when Nixon, all this comes out about Nixon, and Nixon resigns, Gerald R. Ford becomes president of the United States. He is the only person who ever became vice president and president, and he was never elected to either office. Well, of course, he's coming in at a very tumultuous time. Richard Nixon had left in a scandal. Ford wasn't really connected to that scandal, but Gerald Ford decided that it would be better for the nation if he ended it, and he ended it by giving Richard Nixon a presidential pardon. And it's pretty clear that's why he did not win the election, and Jimmy Carter won the election in 1976, becomes president then from 77 through 80 to 1981. So this certainly did cost him that, because it was a close election, but that connection with Nixon and that pardon of Nixon made people believe that somehow all this had been worked out. I don't think it was. But Gerald Ford later on said he knew that cost him the presidency, but he still, even knowing that, he thought he did the right thing to let the nation heal. And perhaps he did. Well, under Jimmy Carter, an interesting character, he's from Georgia. He'd been governor down in Georgia. He was an outsider, and that's what people wanted. They wanted somebody who had no connection with Washington, D.C., and so that's how he gets elected. But the economy begins to really decline under Carter. And not only that, but for, a year, there was the Iran hostage crisis. And this is in the year that he's running for re-election. They are taken hostage. That is, the people, the diplomats, the workers in our embassy in Tehran. They are held there, and they are not released because a sort of radical Islamic government had come to power in Iran, and they wanted to use this as a statement. The United States had been real allies of the Shah of Iran, and so we were seen as the enemy. And so this is what happens. Okay, so this really hurts him. It's on the news every single night. Day 50, day 70, day 71, day 75. There's an update on the Iran crisis every night. A special show starts on television, and it's on every night, just about the hostage crisis, an update with Ted Koppel. And so this is on everyone's mind. And Carter does send in a military team with helicopters to try to go and rescue these people. The helicopters crash in the desert, and the thing fails. So all of these things do not help him at all. He also he signed over Panama Canal. This was unpopular with a lot of people. He signed a deal where basically Panama would take control of the Panama Canal in 1999, which at the end of 99, which they did. So starting since 2000, Panama has controlled the Panama Canal. The United States, of course, had funded and built the canal and controlled it for all those years. He did broker the Camp David Accords. I think this is one of the bright spots in his administration, bringing together Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat in an agreement and a handshake, and this brought an end officially to the war between Israel and Egypt, which had been in ceasefire, but it ended that. Basically trading back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and Egypt recognizing Israel as a nation. So that's a highlight of this thing. By the way, Anwar Sadat just a few months later is assassinated by some people in his country who didn't like that deal. Well, since Jimmy Carter's going to lose, who's he going to lose to? He's going to lose to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan brings about what some people have called the Reagan Revolution. A real change in approach. He was conservative, quite conservative, economically, politically, socially. But he is charming. I mean, even a lot of people who do not like him at all have to agree, well, he is, he's got a way about him, and he's affable, he's charming. He's called the great communicator because he can really get his message across to people. He would give a speech, and people would understand him. He could speak on their level. He could communicate. He's also, by some of his critics, called the Teflon president. Teflon, of course, is the material placed on no-stick pans. They're saying, no matter what troubles come his way, or they don't stick to him, and nobody seems to care. He had been a movie actor, and he's the only movie actor to ever become president. Well, Ronald Reagan believed in a strong military. And since things with the Soviet Union had been lessening somewhat, he is going to intensify that. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. And he starts to build up our military. He said we need to have we'll have peace through strength. This is one of the things that he said. So, a buildup of defensive weapons, a buildup of a strong military, and even people who were involved in the Soviet government later on said that this did force them and economically, and it ultimately led to the demise of the Soviet Union, because they knew that they couldn't, they didn't have the technology to try to keep up with it, they didn't have the money to do it. So he had a thing that was called SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. The media labeled it Star Wars because basically, the movie Star Wars was very popular at the time, and this was talking about setting up a satellite defense system that would basically neutralize Soviet nuclear missiles in the air, or actually in space, before they were armed and before they could be a threat to the United States. This some of this is planned and begun. It was very expensive and very ambitious. It was never fully implemented in the way he thought of it being. Parts of it did come about with missile defense. But the bottom line is it forced the Soviets to feel they were going to have to try to match it, and they couldn't. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. Now, when he's just coming into office, another thing that happens that I think endeared him to some measure with the American people is that John Hinckley tried to assassinate him, actually shot him in the chest. He got off, I think, about 5 or 6 shots, and Reagan was coming out, getting into his car, and he was shot, and they took him to the hospital, and it collapsed his lung, and the bullet was very close to his heart. And they're rushing him into surgery. Reagan said to the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." So I mean, that's shows you a little bit of his character. He had a lot of humor, and he had a way with people. Now, the other thing that he's noted for, not only strong defense, but lowering taxes and what some have called trickle-down economics. The idea here is that if you lower taxes and you make the market freer, then businesses and others will make more money, they'll hire more people, and there'll be more money for everybody all the way down. Okay, so this is something else that he puts into play. He wins re-election handily, and he ends up serving from almost throughout the 80s, from 80 to 88. His vice president that whole time is George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush, interesting life and character. He was in World War II. He was a pilot, actually, fighter pilot. He flew 58 missions. He was shot down at one point into the ocean. His crew did not survive, but he survived, and he eventually, he's picked up by a ship, and he eventually goes back to flying again. But he will begin an oil company in Texas. He's from the East Coast. He's from a wealthy family, but he goes off on his own and starts an oil business in Texas. He starts off as a salesman in it, and then he eventually develops his this company. And he begins to serve in government. He has a very long list. I put it up here just to show you all the different things that he did in his career for the government. He ran for U.S. representative, wins in 1966. I don't believe he won the first time, but he won that time. And he serves then for 4 years, so that means he had two different terms. He is appointed ambassador to the United Nations for a couple of years there in the early 70s. Becomes chairman of the Republican National Committee, the RNC, in 73, 74. He is sent over offered basically to be the ambassador, what would be the U.S. liaisons, the highest office of an American in China, for 2 to 3 years. I visited China, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, and I just happened we walked in, we were walking around showing us stuff, and I walk into this lobby, and here's a big statue of George Herbert Walker Bush shaking the hands of a Chinese official. It's in the lobby of this big restaurant. So I was surprised, to be honest with you, but there it was. He was director of the CIA, 76, 77. And then, of course, he runs for president against Ronald Reagan, does not win, but Reagan chooses him to be his VP. So he's vice president for 8 years, and then he is president for 4 years. So that's just a quick overview of George Bush. Now, one of the things, the United States still controlled the Panama Canal at this point, remember, till 1999. But he led an invasion of Panama because the leader of Panama had been basically threatening to give the U.S. forces there and the canal a hard time. So he leads this invasion. This is like the first time the U.S. had done something like this in many, many years. We just drop paratroopers in, they surround the guy, he's taken and he's arrested. So that just shows some action. But of course, there's going to be a lot more action that comes because he will oversee the end of the Cold War in 1990. Many people believe Ronald Reagan has sort of set that in motion, and Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviet Union. And but once that comes to an end, there's of course a lot of upheaval in Europe and around the world because these two superpowers are now just one. And one of the things I heard him say, that is George Bush say in one of the things that when he was interviewed, is that he decided he would not. Some people wanted him to go to Germany and go and really boast about how the Soviet Union had fallen and how the U.S. had done this. But he didn't do it because he thought it would create more trouble than it was worth for the U.S. and for Germany and others. Well, he ordered the first Gulf War. You know, Iraq had been fighting Iran for several years, and that war had ended. And so you get to the summer of 1990, the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the country to the south. They claimed, and they had some reason to claim it, that the British had cut that section off of Iraq and had created Kuwait, and of course it was rich in oil. And so they marched in and they took it over militarily. They set the oil fields on fire and so on. At any rate, George H.W. Bush will order the first Gulf War early in 1991 after this invasion takes place, and he will. This will lead to the end of that area in Kuwait. Now, he didn't. So he will order the first Gulf War. He will push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. You know, they do go into Iraq, but they did not take over the whole country. This is what some people thought he should have done, but he said, you know, look, we came to push them out of Kuwait. That's what we did. Well, he will have trouble. So he really has a high approval when all that happens, but then the economy begins to decline, and it declines pretty rapidly there as he's running for his second term. That hurts him. He's also running against really two candidates. There's H. Ross Perot, who is an independent candidate, populist kind of candidate who takes off, probably 8 to 10% of the vote that probably would have gone to Bush. And this opens the way for then Bill Clinton to come and become president. Bill Clinton had been governor of Arkansas. He had been there in sort of 2 terms, but was governor for quite a while. And then as he is ending his term as governor, he runs for the president, and he starts out not doing that well. He comes from behind. Even his campaign is filled with scandal about things that he's done while he is governor, finances, especially with his wife, and of course, allegations by women of inappropriate activity. But he overcomes that and he is elected. Once elected, he will be also reelected. Some of the things that he does during his presidency: he signs the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. This removes barriers of trade between Mexico, U.S., and Canada and forms a big bloc, economic bloc. It has some positive effects. It has some negative effects because some manufacturing jobs move to Mexico, and so some people in the United States lose their jobs. Other things become easier to move across the lines for trade. He attempts a national health care reform. He puts that in the hands of his wife, which was very unusual, Hillary, and this brings a lot of criticism, but that attempt fails. As far as foreign policy, he works with Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, and Rabin, the leader of Israel. There are Oslo Accords. These are meetings, sort of secret meetings that are being held in Oslo, Norway. And then he brings them to the United States, and they actually signed the deal in Washington, D.C., and he's there with them, with his encouragement. And so this is probably one of his high points here, is that it brings about some recognition of the Palestinians, that they can have some form of autonomy in the Palestinian territories. He revamps the welfare program, actually reduces the number of people on welfare, and brings about a more accountability for those who are getting welfare, and kind of sets limits as to how long someone can receive welfare benefits. This was something that he had pushed for, because the welfare programs were getting quite large. So he actually reduced that. He's reelected as president in 1996. Again, his trouble with women becomes clear during a report that an intern in the White House named Monica Lewinsky and Clinton had inappropriate relationship. This is all made part of a special counsel report, and the Starr report, as it's called. And this goes to trial in the House, and he is impeached. However, the Senate overturns it, and he remains in office. That was in 1998. Also on the international front, in 1992, he ordered U.S. intervention in Bosnia and also in Kosovo in 1998. So this is part of the former Yugoslavia, which had erupted into all kinds of trouble. We'll say more about it in a few moments. But that's during his watch. He signed the Iraq Liberation Act, opposing Saddam Hussein, and basically saying the United States should work to bring about the end of Saddam Hussein as ruler of Iraq. Now, of course, I think the idea here was perhaps through encouraging a rebellion or a reform in Iraq. The 2000 Camp David Summit, it's called, where he brings together Israel and Palestine again to try to get a peace agreement between them instead of just a sort of recognition of Palestinian, Palestinian control. This fails. This did not work out for him. All right, he is not going to be able to run. He did his 2 terms. His vice president, Al Gore, will run for president. And in a very close race, we will see that. So we're going to see that Al Gore runs for president, and he'll be running against George W. Bush. This is the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. This is George Walker Bush. So this is sometimes just called W. Um, the second Bush. Now, this is the first time you've had a father-son as president since all the way back to the Adams, early in American history. He was the governor of Texas from 94 to 2000 when he becomes president. He was president then for 2 terms. And he wins a controversial and close race against Al Gore, which goes right down to the wire, and there's a recount and so forth. He ends up winning the Electoral College, but the popular vote he loses by a small margin. Now, once he becomes president, and sometimes people forget this, he'd only been president for 8 months. 9/11 takes place. 9/11, September 11th, 2001. On this day, as you can see pictured here, there was coordinated attacks made by terrorists against the United States by hijacking planes, and not hijacking them to take the passengers hostage. This had happened before, but this idea was to make it a suicide mission and to fly those planes into targets. The Twin Towers, the World Trade Buildings in New York, is seen. New York is a symbol of the U.S., a symbol of American finance. They fly the planes into them, they catch on fire, and eventually both of those towers will collapse later that day. Another plane is hijacked, and they fly it into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And a fourth plane, most people believe, was going to be targeted at the Capitol building or perhaps the White House and flown into it. But the people on the plane, the passengers on the plane, mounted a resistance and attacked the terrorists on the plane, and this caused the plane to crash before it could get to Washington, D.C. It crashed in Pennsylvania. So this was a dark day in the United States, and one that George Bush will have to face being a fairly new president, and it's going to shape his presidency. It actually shapes the United States. Many things that we have today come about because of 9/11. For example, the Department of Homeland Security, we did not have before. All the scanning and waiting lines, security lines at airports, we didn't have before. Law enforcement having the ability to monitor your email and phone calls, and many other things. Well, in response to 9/11, it is clear that Osama bin Laden is involved with this, and Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda doesn't have a country that it's stationed in. However, Osama bin Laden and many of the leaders of Al Qaeda are sort of hiding out in Afghanistan, and they would cross from there into Pakistan in the mountains. And so Afghanistan then is targeted as a place where we can root out this hotbed of terrorism. And so that's what got us involved in Afghanistan. We still have troops in Afghanistan. Now, some almost 19 years later, we're trying to exit. We're pretty close, I think, to exiting Afghanistan. And that's been something people have been working on for a while. And it also led to fighting in Iraq, because it was believed that Saddam Hussein had been encouraging, sponsoring terrorism, and that he himself had weapons of mass destruction. He certainly had weapons of mass destruction, gas warfare that he had actually used against his own people. He would just drop gas bombs, weapons in the middle of a town, a city, and poison his own people if they rebelled against him. At any rate, this led to a war in Iraq in 2003, which led to the removal of Saddam Hussein from office, the toppling of his power. And then the United States, for many years, was in Iraq trying to negotiate a new government, a democratic government. At home, he passed broad tax cuts in 2001. Before 9/11, I believe, and then the Patriot Act of 2001. This is the one where I tell you it has all sorts of things in it that are defensive, things that are anti-terrorists, surveillance, and establishing the Department of Homeland Security, and so forth. Also at home, the No Child Left Behind, setting standards-based education, basically making federal money required to get the federal money. You had to have a sort of standards-based or test-based education. So that's still around today in a modified form. He was also instrumental in bringing about a ban to partial birth abortions. This is where an abortion would take place while the child had been partially born, still partially in the woman, but would be then aborted, killed at that point. A ban was put against that kind of thing in 2003. He's reelected in 2004. Early on then in 2005, in the fall of 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a huge hurricane, hit New Orleans. New Orleans, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's actually below sea level. It's below the water level, below the level of the Mississippi. The barriers for the water, the retention walls gave way, and the storm surge and so forth, and about 80% of New Orleans, which is a large city, was flooded. It was a terrible mess and a difficult thing. And of course, George Bush was criticized for the response of FEMA and others. And then in 2008, at the end, almost the end of his term, the fall of the election, the financial crisis takes place. What had been happening was there had been legislation basically set forth in Congress that said that people, there shouldn't be barriers to people buying houses, and so you should lower the requirements for getting a home loan. That had repercussions, because once you started doing that, then it got to the place where it was pretty clear some of the people getting home loans were not going to be able to pay back the loans. But the banks took the risk, and then what they decided is they would bundle all those bad loans and sell them off to people who were buying them just as a kind of at very low cost, because they figured they're going to fail anyway. At any rate, it gets kind of complicated, but it's basically a house of cards. So the prices of houses kept going up. Getting a loan was very easy, and in the end, it inflated all the prices of homes. And then it became clear that when all of these home loans began to fail, that well, everybody was going to lose out, and we had a huge crash in 2008 because of the speculation by the banks on these loans. Well, running for office at the time was Barack Obama against John McCain. Barack Obama had very limited sort of government activity. He had been in the Illinois State House as a state senator, and then he ran for a senatorial seat that was opened up, and he actually won that one. So he didn't serve out his full term as senator. He had to step down from that when he is elected president. He will serve 2 terms, 2008 to 2016. He's the first African American president. Domestically, he does quite a bit. He's very ambitious. At first, he could get some of the stuff passed. Later on, he's going to use executive orders to basically just sign things into being without going through the Congress. But one of the things he brings about in 2009 is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This is to overcome a lot of the economic problems of the financial crash in 2008. And of course, probably the most famous thing that he was involved with is called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is normally just called Obamacare, which he passes in 2010. And the ramifications of this are still working their way out, as there's been some problems with it, but it certainly brings insurance coverage to some people that didn't have it. He's reelected in 2012, and now once reelected, I think some of his more, of course, Obamacare was pretty controversial, but other controversial policies come out. For example, he begins to push for same-sex marriage in 2015, and eventually will, it's never voted through by Congress. It is done through some executive orders, some judicial action, that this becomes policy. He begins to pull troops from Iraq as well, overseas. The troops had to return to Iraq, something which some people say perhaps he pulled them out too soon or didn't do the things he should have done afterwards, because what happens is when we pull out, it's pretty complicated, but Iraq is a country that is mostly Sunni Muslims and mostly Shia Muslims, and the Sunni Muslims have been controlling things. So when Saddam Hussein is taken out of the picture, now they're trying to bring in a democratic government, and it's primarily Shia Muslims, and so the Sunnis are going to be out of the picture, so to speak. They're not going to have power. And this brings about Al-Qaeda, or those who were formerly affiliated with Al-Qaeda, to come in and begin fighting in Iraq to try to fight for the Sunni Muslims. They also then get involved in Syria, and they set up what is sometimes called ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And so this leads to, we have continuing problems there still today in Syria. All right, well, he is out of the picture after that. He served his 2 terms, and we start to see then, Hillary Clinton will run for president, and then, of course, Donald Trump will win. This is the current president. And so you probably know more about this more recent stuff. But as you probably know, Donald Trump is a billionaire. He made his money in real estate. He owns a lot of hotels, golf courses, casinos, and so forth. He was on television as the host of The Apprentice, a reality show. And he is elected in a closely contested race with Hillary Clinton. There were charges of the Russians trying to influence people through Facebook ads, things like that. But nonetheless, he wins the election, and his policy of putting America first, or Make America Great Again, MAGA, as the hats, the red hats that are given out. So he's very controversial, but he's running for re-election right now. One of the things he had promised was to build a wall. The wall would be, of course, across the south of Mexico, and to secure the border from illegal drugs, from illegal immigration, sex trafficking, terrorism, and so forth. And so this wall is being built, but of course it's been held up in court and through finances, through the Congress, and so forth. As of January of 2020, about 100 miles were built. The goal is to build 450 miles. So we'll see how that goes. He was impeached officially in December of 2019. This is over a controversy where it was said that he tried to use his influence with the leader of the Ukraine to launch some kind of investigation into Joe Biden's son, who had dealings in the Ukraine. The House of Representatives set forth the articles of impeachment and went to the Senate in 2020, early 2020, and the Senate acquitted him on both charges. So he's remaining in office and running for re-election. But probably the largest challenge that he has faced so far is one that's very current to us right now, COVID-19. Which knowledge of this begins to come out in January, February, and we begin to see. So as we know, COVID-19, or the coronavirus outbreak, started in China and has moved all around the world. So this is affecting, of course, the economy, which is doing great. Prior to this, of course, now everything is shut down. So the point when I'm saying, speaking this, we still don't know all the final outcome of that. Now I want to turn our attention for the last couple of slides here to take a look at Latin America since 1945. Latin America, you see pictured here, of course, usually thought to be Mexico, Central America, South America, and including several of the islands out in the Caribbean is usually put into that category as well. The Great Depression in the 1930s hit this area very hard because their governments, their economies were rather weak and quite dependent upon the United States and Europe. And when the Great Depression hits, of course, they had big problems because their economy goes down and this brings upheaval. There are military coups where basically military leaders, generals, and so forth will take charge of the government. So Latin America, which I'm going to abbreviate LA, mostly provided raw materials and minerals, oil, beef, other kinds of foodstuffs, and would buy the finished goods from the United States and Europe. But of course, when the economy goes south there because of the Great Depression, we're not buying as much from them. Therefore, their economy greatly suffers. The Depression sees their exports, that is, like the United States and Europe, half. We're buying half what we used to. Their revenues are down. And Latin America begins to be more radicalized, but then also deciding we need to take control of our industries, especially oil and steel, which they begin to do. In the 1960s and 70s, though, they are still dependent mostly on the U.S. and Europe, but a new player in this is Japan, who has technology and money to be able to invest in this part of the world. But there's high poverty rates. There's a real disparity between those who are wealthy and those who are very poor. And so this brings about instability. Even more military-led governments will take even more power. And basically, these governments are living on borrowed money. They have had borrowed money and investments. And basically, the governments are just making enough money to pay the interest. If you ever had a credit card where you just kept paying the interest and didn't really pay on the principal, then things go bad for them. They couldn't pay the interest, and that's when things begin to get more radical. People wanted more democracy, and actually, to be quite honestly, they wanted more of a Marxist or a leftist perspective. Those begin to form, and we see then, of course, that will begin to put them at odds with the United States and others in the West who don't support, say, a Marxist government. People like Hugo Chavez and Muros in Argentina and Colombia and so forth, we see very radical outcomes there. The United States does try to take a different. We had been very active, very controlling, but we begin to try to back off of that somewhat in the 50s and the 60s. But we are still, we're the largest investor in Latin America. A lot of companies there. United Fruit Company with bananas and other fruits that are grown there, that sort of thing. But the Organization of American States is formed in 1951. And this was formed, under the encouragement of the United States, but it begins with 21 Latin American states. It now has 35. The map you see here with all those red pins is showing all the different countries that are a part of it. It's virtually every country. I don't think it has Chile, perhaps. Chile, I don't know. There might be a couple that are left out, but almost all of them in South America, Central America, and most of the Caribbean is involved in this now. Even Canada joined, I think, about 1990. So it now includes Canada, the United States, and South America, Central America in this Organization of American States. What are they there for? To try to bring security to the area and promote democracy, kind of like a United Nations of the Americas, I guess we could call it. Here you see their symbol, and here you see the map that shows the member nations. As leftist governments grew during the Cold War, of course, the United States begins to see them as a threat because these leftists are aligning themselves with the Soviet Union, with communist principles, Marxist ideology. This brings the United States to often get more involved and bring more action to the area, like what we saw with George Herbert Walker Bush in Panama and that sort of thing. Let me just pick one area. Because I've been talking to you now for quite a while. But this will be our last screen. And I'm just going to use one example to show how radicalized areas can be seen as a threat by the U.S. and how it could bring a lot of tension. The island of Cuba that you see here in this map, as you probably know, is located just about 90 miles south of Florida, Key West. I guess according to that map, 234 miles south of Miami, Florida. It is ruled by a man named Batista, and Batista had been the president, but even when he wasn't the president, he was kind of running things. And he had been elected president, and he kind of controlled who was president after that. And then in the 50s, he came back to be elected again as president. And it looked like he wasn't going to win, so he'd been in the military leader. He took over in a military coup. So he's running Cuba, had been running Cuba for quite a while. Cuba, you have to understand, had very close relations with the U.S., and a lot of people went to Cuba like they were going to Las Vegas. So, all the things you think about, gambling and nightclubs and mafia and all this kind of stuff is going on in Havana, and so there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of things going on there. Okay, rising up against that then will be Marxist, communists, Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. Who are kind of in exile. They've sort of left Cuba to form a group that's going to come back and take over Cuba, along with Che Guevara. And so these three along with some others, land, and then they begin to stir up trouble in Cuba and eventually lead a revolution in Cuba. And Fidel Castro will come to power as the leader of Cuba and will be from 1959 to 2008 when he finally steps down because he was quite ill, and put it in the hands of his brother, Raul, who is now ruling Cuba. Fidel Castro dies in 2016. They seized Havana in 1959, and Castro increasingly is getting aid, support, looking to the Soviet Union as a kind of model, and quite frankly for money and weapons. John F. Kennedy, JFK, there had been a plan, it was in place, it was being worked on, that would bring about a way to let Cuban exiles, that is, many people left when Castro took over. They wanted to come back and, in their view, liberate Cuba from Castro. So there was 1,400 of them with help from the CIA, and they were going to come down and invade Cuba, and the idea was they would gain support once they got down there from locals, and they could push Fidel Castro out of power. The whole thing was a complete failure, kind of embarrassing for Kennedy and others, and it fails. But it just shows the tension between, because Cuba is so close to the United States, and now a communist government is there. Castro really steps up the pressure. He goes to the Soviets and he asks them to bring nuclear missiles and set them up at bases in Cuba that would be aimed at the United States. And the idea here is that these missiles, some of them would be shorter range. They could hit Washington, D.C. They could hit Chicago, perhaps. They could certainly hit Atlanta, Florida. And then there was going to be other ones that were set up that were longer range. This is discovered by using a spy plane. It's called a U-tube spy plane. It could take pictures from way up high, and they could zoom in and they could see what was going on. They figured it out. So Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and said it would stay in place until the missiles were removed, and they weren't going to allow any Soviet ships there. So it was a real standoff in October of 1962. It could very well have led to a war between the Soviet Union and the United States, and perhaps a nuclear war that perhaps could have wiped out, well, maybe the whole world. So this was a very tense situation. Eventually, the Soviet ships will turn around and leave, and they will remove all the stuff from Cuba. The crisis is averted. But you see the tension that comes about. Cuba, of course, remains an ally of the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union is no more, disintegrates 89-90. There's no money left there. There's no one left there. They had a real rough period in the 90s, financially speaking, because there has been an embargo. The U.S. had an embargo since, well, 1959, 1960, all the way up until very recently, trade embargo. So they weren't getting any money from the United States. So they started, now they are being aided by communist China. Obama, when he becomes president, begins to ease the sanctions, allow travel, and allow trade. President Trump has indicated that he might reverse this policy, although hasn't taken any action to do that as of yet. Well, this was a long one, but we'll end it there for now.